Good morning. I want to invite you to James chapter 5 this morning, please. James chapter 5. We're going to read that passage, and then we're going to look at some Old Testament texts together from the book of Exodus and from the book of Numbers. But read with me, if you would, James 5, verse 7. Be patient, therefore, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. Behold, the farmer waits for the produce of the soil, being patient about it until it gets the early and the late rains. You too be patient. Strengthen your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Do not complain, brethren, against one another, that you yourselves may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing right at the door. As an example, brethren, of suffering and patience, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Behold, we count those blessed who endured. You've heard of the endurance of Job and have seen the outcome of the Lord's dealings, that the Lord is full of compassion and is merciful. I want you to see that James, as he writes here, talks about a couple ways that faith can be thwarted. We can run out of patience with our faith. We can get tired in our faith. And that weariness, that tiredness, that lack of patience can manifest itself in two ways. It can manifest itself in us being discontent with God, and it can manifest itself in us being discontent with each other. I want you to see how those two things are connected together in the text. Note how he says in verse 7, he starts with admonishing us to be patient. He ends with patience. And in verse 11, and sandwiched between those two admonitions about patience, he warns us about losing patience with God, and he warns us about losing patience with each other. And so he says in verse 8, you too be patient. Strengthen your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. He said part of the way that we keep patient is we keep looking for God's coming. We stay cognizant of the fact that He is the judge. We trust that He is there, that He is before us, and that He will keep His promises. And then He warns us about losing patience with each other. Verse 9, do not complain, brethren, against one another, that you yourselves may not be judged. And so He says, don't complain, because the Lord is coming again. And you'll give an account for your impatience with each other. And so he says, behold, the judge is standing right at the door. And then he again admonishes us about this whole concept of being patient, even when we find ourselves in trials, even when we find ourselves in suffering. We've had to make a new rule in the car. Abraham and Omar sit in the back seat. And sometimes we have to say, Abraham, you can't lean over. Because when he leans over, it's provocative to Omar. And sometimes we have to tell Omar not to whine, because sometimes Omar gets to whining about Abraham. And they get to nitpicking with each other. Now, these two boys love each other. Abraham's a good big brother, and Omar's a good little brother. But they're together a lot, and they're together in the back seat a lot. And they get on each other's nerves, and they start to whine, and they start to whimper, and they start to complain. And you know what happens when they do that? We start to whine and to whimper and complain. I mean, we do the same thing. And so it becomes a bit contagious, that whining and that whimpering and that complaining. Whining and complaining is childish, is it not? It is. It happens with children. And we have to be careful about it happening. We are the children of God, but that's not what God bought us for. It's not what He purposed us for. And so we have to watch being impatient, either being impatient with God and discontent about our lot in life, either as individuals or as families or as a people. And we have to be watchful and wary about our discontentment with each other, about us getting nitpicky with one another. I want us to go to the book of Exodus, because there's a lot that's said in the story of Israel about the business of being impatient with God and with each other. and about having a heart of complaining. The word that's used over and over again is the word murmuring. Murmur is an onomatopoetic word. It's a word that sounds like what it is. The word murmur came from the sound that people make when people murmur. Murmur, 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 murmur. I mean, if you're listening to a group of people talking, that's what you hear. And the more, and you can tell, can't you, a sound of a people that are happy, what that sounds like, and you can tell the sound of a people that are discontent. And murmur, murmur, murmur is the sound of a people that are discontent. The tone of it, the mood of it, the disposition of the people, and murmuring just became a habit among the people of Israel when they were in the wilderness. So I want to talk a little bit this morning about why do we murmur? Because it's not for no reason. I mean, there is always a reason behind behavior. There's a reason why siblings nitpick at each other. And there's always a reason why people complain. There's a reason for people's murmuring. And so I want to talk about why is it that we murmur and how do we stop? Because we find in the various texts that talk about that in Israel, we find both of those. We can see in the context the reason why they murmured, and we can also see in the text some solutions to the problem. So I want us to look first at Exodus chapter 14, because it's the first occasion that we read about Israel murmuring when they were in the wilderness. And so it says in Exodus 14 and verse 10, Israel has come to the Red Sea, and Pharaoh and his armies and chariots are right on their heels. And so it says in verse 10 that as Pharaoh drew near, the sons of Israel looked, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them. And guess what? They got scared. And so it says that they became very frightened, so that the sons of Israel cried out to the Lord. And listen, look at what they cried in verse 11. They said to Moses, "Is it because there were no graves in Egypt that you've taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you dealt with us in this way, bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the word that we spoke to you in Egypt, saying, 'Leave us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians, for it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness'?" Why are they murmuring? They're murmuring because they're afraid. They're murmuring because of fear. They're murmuring because they're scared. And that's frequently a reason why people murmur against God, is because they're afraid. They don't know what's going to happen next. It's a danger for us in our country because of things that are happening politically, because of things that are happening economically, because of policies in our nation. It's a danger for us to lose faith in God, to murmur about our circumstance. It is good for us to be concerned about the morality of our nation. It's good for us to teach people. But to lose faith is not good. To lose faith is not right. To live in fear is not the way that believers behave. And yet, that's what's causing the murmuring on the part of Israel here. That's what's causing them to complain. And their speech is all indicative of their lack of faith. We would have been a lot better off if God had just left us in bondage. If God had just left us alone, we would have been a lot better living in Egypt than we would dying in the wilderness. And they've already forgotten what life was like in Egypt. They've forgotten about their slavery. They've forgotten about how they complained when they were there. They weren't happy in Egypt, and now they're not happy in the wilderness. They weren't happy when they were abandoned there in slavery, but they're not happy when God has done all of this to save them. And so their fear is manifesting itself in their complaint or in their murmuring. And so we can be scared about our own personal circumstance. We can be frightened about our future. We can be frightened about our family. We can be frightened about our health. We can be frightened about our circumstances. We can be frightened about our finances. We can be frightened as a people about things congregationally, about one another. But that is... living that way is not the way that God purposed us to live. It is not the way of a people of faith. And so what's the solution? What's the solution to murmuring about our fears and talking faithless that way? Well, in verse 14, Moses said to the people, "Do not fear. Stand by and see the salvation of the Lord, which He will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you've seen today, you will never see them again forever. The Lord will fight for you while you keep silent." The solution to fear, to murmuring about our fears, is to look for God. Look for God. Stand by and look for God. And we need to talk about how we're looking for God. I don't know what God's going to do, but God's going to do something, because God always does something when people hurt. I don't know what God's going to do, but God's going to show up, because God always shows up when people look to Him in faith. Tell me one time God didn't do that. One time when people looked to God in faith and when God failed them. I cannot think of one time that people looked to God in faith and that God failed them. He never does fail. And so I need to look for God by looking back at the stories, the heritage, the legacy we have of how God showed up over and over again, how He pelted our enemies with plagues in order to deliver us from bondage, how He parted the Red Sea so that we could walk through on the dry land. Over and over again, God has been faithful. And He wasn't just faithful in the past, He will always be faithful until He comes again. That's what James is saying. We look with patience to the coming of the Lord, because God will be faithful. He will come. He will show up. And so looking for God is the way that we treat the problem of our fear, so that we don't murmur about it. We talk our faith, trusting that God will show. Look at Exodus chapter 15 and verse 22. Just after God rescues them by crossing the Red Sea, they no sooner complete their song of praise than they found something else to murmur about. And so in verse 22 it says that Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went out into the wilderness of Shur. And they went 3 days in the wilderness, and they found no water. Guess what? Murmur. Murmur, 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 murmur. No water. Murmur. And so it says in verse 23, and they came to Marah. They could not drink the water. So they found some water in Marah, but they could not drink the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. Therefore it was named Marah, which means bitter, of course. And so the people grumbled at Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" They murmured. Why do people murmur? They murmur because of fear. But they also murmur because they're uncomfortable or because they're inconvenienced. And that's what's happening here, right? They're thirsty. And so what do you do when you're thirsty? I'm thirsty. Isn't that what kids do? Children, they're thirsty. Give me something to drink. I'm thirsty. And so that's what Israel's doing. They're uncomfortable. They're inconvenienced. And so they complain about the fact that they don't have what they want. They don't have even here what they need. And so they murmur about the fact that they're uncomfortable or they're inconvenienced. And frequently that is a reason why people murmur. It's because something has inconvenienced them in some way, or something is uncomfortable for them in some way, or something is an imposition on them in some way. And so we either get discontent with God because of the imposition, or because of the discomfort, or because of the inconvenience, or we get discontent with each other because we're inconvenienced and we're imposed upon in some way. And so that's the spirit of the people here as they're complaining about that. Well, I want you to look at what the solution is to the problem of being uncomfortable and inconvenienced, what we should do instead of complaining. Look at what Moses teaches us in verse 25. Then he cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree, and he threw it in the waters, and the waters became sweet. There he made for them a statute. Let's stop there. We'll get to the second part in a second. I just want you to see that there was a problem. They were uncomfortable and they were inconvenienced, and one man prayed. How pitiful is that? One man prayed. Why didn't the whole congregation pray? Why weren't they all asking God, help us? But they didn't. They just murmured. And so Moses does the thing that everybody should have been doing. There was a problem. They all should have prayed about the problem. But they didn't pray. They just griped about it. And so what do you do? What do you do with a people like that? they need to learn to pray. Over and over again in the wilderness, Israel makes that mistake. We don't read about them talking to God. We just read about them complaining to each other. But Moses taught them, you need to cry out to God when there's a problem. And watch and see what God does. Here's the second thing that Moses teaches them. When, look at verse 25 and 26, we find that the reason for their thirst was not an accident. It was very intentional on God's part. And so it says he cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree, and he threw it into the waters, and the waters became sweet. It says, there he made for them a statute and a regulation, and there he tested them. This was on purpose. God let them go thirsty on purpose because he was testing them. And he said, if you will give earnest heed to the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his sight and give ear to his commandments and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you which I have put on the Egyptians, for I, the Lord, am your healer. God wants to be their healer. He wants to be their helper. But part of the reason why he lets them hurt is to teach them that he's the healer. Part of the reason why he lets them go thirsty is to let them know that he is the water that they need. Part of the reason why he lets them go hungry is because they need to learn that he is their source of everything. He's their source of bread. He's their source of life. And so he's testing them to see if they'll look to trust him that way. So I want to suggest to you that one of the things that we need to look for when we are uncomfortable or when we're inconvenienced and when we're apt to murmur about that, is there something God is trying to teach me in this? Has he let me be thirsty? Has he let me be hungry? Has he let my belly ache because I need to learn something about belly aching? Maybe he's teaching me that. And it seems it was definitely the case, because he says so, that's exactly what he was teaching Israel. He was teaching them lessons and letting them suffer. And so when I am uncomfortable and inconvenienced, two things I can do. I can pray, and I can look for what God is trying to teach me in this. And I guarantee you will not go wrong if you do those two things. If you pray and if you ask, what's God trying to teach me here? It may be that he's trying to teach you that he's the healer, and that you need to look to him in faith and find out that he will take away your discomfort, he will take away your inconvenience, or he will teach you something through it that's a better thing than being uncomfortable. That's a better thing than being inconvenienced. That it's not so bad if God teaches me something bigger in it. Such was the case with Israel. Number 3, look at Exodus chapter 17, if you would. Exodus chapter 17. And we find a third reason why they and why we murmur. Exodus chapter 17 and verse 1 of the text. It says, then all the congregation of the sons of Israel journeyed by stages from the wilderness of Sin, according to the command of the Lord. And they camped at Rephidim, and there was no water for the people to drink. Does that sound familiar? And they've been in this predicament before, right? There's no water. Look at verse 2. Therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, give us water that we may drink. And Moses said to them, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord? But the people thirsted there for the water, and they grumbled against Moses and said, why now have you brought us from Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? I want you to see that the murmuring has escalated here. It's not just that the people are complaining. Now the people are quarreling. And they're quarreling with Moses. And so the people have been discontent, and now that discontent is bubbling up and becoming worse. I just want to say to you that murmuring is that way. It's contagious. It's like the kids in the back seat. They start to gripe, and then you start to gripe at them, and then you start to gripe at each other. And so it's a whole household, or it's a whole culture of discontentment. And such is happening with Israel, is it's becoming commonplace now. And so they're quarreling with the leadership. They're quarreling with Moses. And so why are they doing so? What is it a symptom of here? Well, it's a symptom that they're divided. They're not united as a people. They're not united with the leader that God has appointed for them. They are divided. And when people are divided, what do? When people are divided, they start looking for who to blame. You know, we are uncomfortable and we're inconvenienced. Again, we don't have water. And so whose fault is it? Well, Moses is the leader. It must be his fault. And so they're griping about Moses. They're quarreling with him because there's got to be somebody to blame. And so Moses must be the one who's at fault. And not only is it the case that when people are divided, do they look for problems, but the problems they look for are petty. Has God taken care of the thirst problem before? Yeah. Is this a big deal? No, it's not a big deal. God can make water for us in the wilderness. He's done it before. God can take lots of water and He can divide it. And so God can find water for us in the wilderness. This ain't a problem. And so Moses' question is legitimate. Why are you complaining to me? Pray to God. Why are you quarreling with me about this? And so the problems that they're quarreling over, that they're looking for, are problems that are petty problems. So what do you do when people are divided and when people murmur because they're looking for someone to blame or because they're looking for problems and problems that are petty? Well, look at what we read of in verse 4. Moses is so wise and humble in his response. It says, so Moses cried out to the Lord. What do you do when people are divided? You pray for people that are divided. That's what you do. You pray that God will unite the people that are divided. And so Moses cries out to the Lord about the predicament, and he says, what shall I do to this people? A little more and they'll stone me. Moses is worried about his own life here. He's crying out because of fear. But he's crying out to God, which is the thing that I want us to see. The second thing that I want you to see is what God tells Moses to do. Verse 5. Then the Lord said to Moses, pass before, and listen to this carefully, what the wisdom and what the Lord advises Moses to do. He says, pass before the people and take with you some of the elders of Israel. And so he wants us to be public. He says, you go in front of the people, and he says, you take some of the elders with you, and you take in your hand your staff, with which you struck the Nile, and go. So he wants Moses to go in front of the people, pass in front of them, take the leadership with him, and have in his hand the staff that was used to strike the Nile. And he says in verse 6, and listen to this, it's so important to see this. The Lord says, behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water will come out of it that the people may drink. When people are not at peace, when people are divided, what do they need? What people need when they're divided is they need to see God. They need to see God. That's the reason why they're complaining, is that they're looking at each other. They're looking for problems. They're looking for petty things. They're looking for who to blame. They're not looking for God. And so the way in which Moses needs to behave before the people is he needs to pray for them. The second thing that he needs to do is he needs to show them God. They need to see God again because they're not looking for Him. They're not trusting in Him. And so Moses needs to behave in a way that shows the people God. Pass before them. Let them see that you're following me. Take the leadership with you. Let them see that the leadership is going to God. Take the staff that God used to turn the Nile into blood. Carry that with you and strike the rock, and I will stand in front of you. It's so important to see that. They're going to see me when they see you on the rock. I will stand in front of you, and the people will drink. It is so important when you're not in harmony with other people. I don't care if it's in your family, or if it's in your workplace, if it's in your friendships, if it's in our relationships with each other. It is so important that you don't lose your humility when people are at conflict with you, but that you pray for them and about them, and that you show them God in the way that you behave. Because you can lose that. Moses lost it later on. The second time that Moses struck the rock, God was not standing in front of Moses. Moses was standing in front of God. And it's what went wrong. He wasn't standing behind God. He was standing in front of Him. And so when people are divided, and I don't care where the disharmony is, any place, it's because people don't see God. If they saw God, they would be at peace. If they saw God, things would be better. And so Moses needs to show them God, and God teaches them how. He teaches them how to do that. Peace problems come from being puffed up. Peace problems come from being unmerciful toward others instead of being humble before God. So the best solution is to humble yourself before God and teach others to do the same. Number 4. Look, if you would, at Numbers chapter 11. Numbers chapter 11. And I want you to see another reason why people complain. Look at Numbers 11. Begin there in verse 1 with me. Now the people became like those who complain of adversity in the hearing of the Lord. I want you to see another escalation. They quarreled with Moses. Now the people complain like someone who is in adversity in the hearing of the Lord. And it says, and when the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled. I want you to see that God eventually himself gets impatient with murmuring. And that's what's happened here. He's put up with it for a good while now. And now the Lord isn't putting up with it anymore. And so we've seen God show mercy toward the murmuring, but God is running out of mercy now with the complaints of the people. And so his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. The people therefore cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire died out. So the name of the place was called Taberah, because the fire of the Lord burned among them. So God caused, I don't know if it was a lightning storm that caused a fire, or if it was a campfire or something. The fact that it says fire of the Lord makes me think that there was lightning from heaven, and it started a fire, and some of the people were burned up in the fire. We're not told what they were complaining about, we just were told they were complaining. But in the next verse, we're told about what they were complaining about, and in another occasion, verse 4 it says, and the rabble who were among them had greedy desires, and also the sons of Israel wept again and said, who will give us meat to eat? We remember the fish which we used to eat free in Egypt. Can you believe they said that? Free? Really? We remember the fish we used to eat free in Egypt, and the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the onions and the garlic, and you could just see them licking their lips thinking about how good they had it in Egypt. But now our appetite is gone. Listen to this. There is nothing at all to look at except this manna. Verse 10 says, now Moses heard the people, listen, Moses heard the people weeping throughout their families, each man at the doorway of his tent. And the anger of the Lord was kindled greatly, and Moses was displeased. Talk about contagious. I mean, everyone in their home is grumbling. When you grumble, you know what you teach your kids to do? Teach them to grumble. When you murmur, you raise a household of murmurers. And so here they, every tent, they're just murmur, 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 murmur. They're all complaining. What's the symptom here? What's this indicative of? What's the problem? Why are they murmuring? They're murmuring because they're ungrateful, right? They're murmuring because they're spoiled. They're murmuring because there is no gratitude in their hearts for all that God has done with them. When they said all there is to look at is this manna, have they forgotten where the manna came from? Where did the manna come from? God rained it down from heaven. Here is heaven's bread. They didn't have to, every other nation had to go and work and make bread by the sweat of their brow, but not Israel. Their bread came from heaven. They were living in a tub of butter, and they didn't appreciate it. God was raining bread from heaven. Every day they were seeing a miracle of God keeping the soles on their shoes, and of God filling their table with bread. And on Friday they got a double portion, so they didn't have to do anything on Saturday, not even go gather it. And yet we got nothing to look at, no meat. Where's the meat? All we got is this bread. So God gave them meat to eat. In fact, He said He's going to give them so much meat, it's going to come out of their nostrils. He's going to give them so much meat, it's going to make them sick. And He didn't just make them sick, He struck them with a plague. with the meat that they ate. If you look at the end of the passage in verse 33 of the text, it says, while the meat was still between their teeth, before it was chewed, the anger of the Lord was kindled against the people, and the Lord struck the people with a very severe plague. Then it goes on to give the name of the place there. And so God has run out of patience with the complaint of the people. And so some have died in a fire now, and some have died with a plague, because they have hearts that are ungrateful, that are embittered against God, and not thankful for His gifts and for His promises. So I want you to see, too, just how, let me say this. What do we do? What do we do about the problem of murmuring because of ingratitude? One thing I want you to see that we do is we have to let God chasten people. Some people had to hurt from the fire. Some people had to hurt from the plague. And sometimes that just has to happen. Sometimes you can't do something to intervene. If folks have a heart of ingratitude, sometimes God just has to take them down a notch. And we just have to let that happen. But when that happens, we don't rejoice that it happens. I want you to see that the second thing that Moses does is he prays for the people. Look, if you would, at verse 2. It says, therefore the people, when the fire came, the people cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire died out. So Moses didn't rejoice that God had to chasten the people. He prayed for the people. He has compassion for them. And that's one of the things that you do for people that are ungrateful. You need to pray for them. Moses prayed for them. The third thing that you have to do is that you have to fight your own self-pity and your own ingratitude, because ingratitude is very, very contagious. And I want you to see how that impacts Moses as well. Look at how his own attitude is affected by it. Verse 11 says, Moses said to the Lord, why have you been so hard on your servant? Why are you picking on me, God? Why have I not found favor in your sight that you've laid the burden of all this people on me? Why am I having to listen to them? Verse 12, was it I who conceived all the people? I mean, these aren't my kids. Why am I having to look after them in the woods? Was it I who brought them forth that thou shouldest say to me, carry them in your bosom as a nurse carries a nursing infant to the land which thou didst swear to thy fathers? Where am I to get meat to give to all this people? For they weep before me, saying, give us meat that we may eat. I alone am not able to carry all this people, because it's too burdensome for me. So if thou art to deal with me thus, please kill me at once. If I have found favor in your sight, then do not let me see my wretched end. So Moses says, I'm tired of this, God. Just take my life now. Just not take my life and let it be. Just take my life. He's ready to leave. He's ready to give up. And one of the things that you have to fight when you're affected by ingratitude is not to feel self-pity, not to feel ungrateful yourself. The fact was that God was blessing Moses. God was teaching Moses. God was shaping his heart the same way that he was shaping Israel. And so Moses had to learn to fight his own self-pity and his own ingratitude. He expresses it again in verse 21. He says, the people among whom I am are 600,000 on foot. Yes, yet thou hast said, I will give them meat in order that they may eat for a whole month. Now look at what he says in verse 22. Should flocks and herds be slaughtered for them to be sufficient for them? Or should all the fish of the sea be gathered together for them to be sufficient for them? Moses is starting to lose it here. And so the Lord says to him in verse 23, is the Lord's power limited, Moses? Now you shall see whether my word will come true for you or not. And so Moses needs to have his own faith fortified here. And so God shows him his power by bringing quail, and he shows him his power by multiplying leadership, so that Moses isn't bearing the burden all by himself. And so ingratitude is one of the reasons why people complain. Look at chapter 12. Look at Numbers chapter 12. Verse 1, then Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married, for he had married a Cushite woman. And they said, has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us as well? And the Lord heard it. One of the reasons why people murmur is because of jealousy. Ostensibly, the reason why they murmured against Moses was because of who he married. They didn't like his wife. They didn't like the Cushite woman that he was married to. But it's manifested in what they say about Moses, that this was not about who Moses married. That was just the trigger. The problem was that they were jealous of Moses' influence and of his position among the Israelites. And so it says, verse 2, that they said, has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us as well? We're just as good as he is. We're prophets too. And so there's a spirit of jealousy that's been the source of their murmuring against Moses. Look at what happens then in verse 4. It says, and suddenly the Lord said to Moses and to Aaron and Miriam, you three come out to the tent of meeting. So the three of them came out. And the Lord came down in a pillar of cloud and stood at the doorway of the tent, and he called Aaron and Miriam. And when they had come forward, he said, hear now my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, shall make myself known to him in a vision. I shall speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He's faithful in all my house. With him I speak mouth to mouth, even openly, and not in dark sayings. And behold the form of the Lord, and he beholds the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant and against Moses? The thing I want you to see here is that Moses does nothing here. The Lord is the one who deals with the problem of jealousy. And it's so important that if you feel like you're the object of jealousy, and again, in whatever the setting is, if it's at work, if it's at play, if it's at school, if it's in the community, if it's in our relationships with each other, if you feel like you're the object of jealousy, you leave that to God. That is not your place. I don't know the hearts of men. You don't know the hearts of men. Moses doesn't know the heart of Aaron and Miriam here. And so if there is a spirit of jealousy in them, God will take care of it. And God does take care of it. He takes care of it in exactly the right way. And so it's not my place to meddle in the matters of other people's hearts. It is my place to give them to God and let Him handle whatever it is, whatever the motive is that's out of place. God can take care of it. And God does take care of it with Aaron and Miriam. The second thing that I want us to see in way of a solution is that if I am not the object of it, if I am the one who has the jealousy, then there needs to be repentance. Look at what happens in verse 11. Because the Lord strikes Miriam with leprosy. And so Aaron says in verse 11, he says to Moses, "O my Lord, I beg you, do not account this sin to us, in which we have acted foolishly and in which we have sinned. Oh, do not let her be like one dead, whose flesh is half eaten away when he comes from his mother's womb." And so Aaron repents here. The third thing that I want you to see is not only is there repentance on the part of Aaron, but there's intercession on the part of Moses. If people have bad motives, you need to pray for their bad motives. In verse 13, it says, Moses cried out to the Lord, saying, "O God, heal her, I pray." And God does, but He lets her sit in her leprosy for a little while. I mean, it's part of God's chastisement, His admonition of her. But Moses shows a good heart in that Moses intercedes on her behalf. The final text that I want you to consider is in chapter 14 of Numbers. Numbers chapter 14. And if you would read with me verse 1. Then all the congregation lifted up their voices and cried, and the people wept that night. And all the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole congregation said to them, "Would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become plunder. Would it not be better for us to return to Egypt?" So they said to one another, "Let us appoint a leader and return to Egypt." This is where Israel has come to the land. The spies have gone into the land. They brought back the report that the land is indeed abundant. It flows with milk and honey. But there are fortified cities and there are giants in the land, and we can never take them. And so it would have been better for us if God had left us in Egypt. It'd be better for us if we died in the wilderness. We're not going to die fighting in the land. Let's go back. And so let's vote for a new leader. Why do they complain? What does it teach us about murmuring? Well, it teaches us that people murmur when they're disengaged. People murmur when they're uninvolved. People complain when they're not on the journey with you. Do you see that's part of the problem all along? Israel isn't going anywhere. They didn't leave Canaan, they didn't leave Egypt to go somewhere. Moses is on the journey, and there's some like Joshua and Caleb that they're going somewhere, but the people as a whole, they don't have a vision. They don't see where they're going. They don't have something they're going to. All they talk about all the time in the wilderness is where they came from. They're always looking backwards. They're never looking forward. They're always looking back to Egypt and longing for this land. They're not longing for that land. And so part of why people murmur is because they're not on the journey. They're not engaged. So they don't get why we do things. They don't get decisions. They're not involved in them. They don't participate in them. They just gripe because they're not on the journey. So what do you do when people aren't on the journey? What do you do when people are disengaged and when they're uninvolved? Verse 5 rather. You get down, is what you do. Moses and Aaron fell on their faces in the presence of all the assembly of the congregation of the sons of Israel. When people are not on the journey, you got to get humble before them. And you got to stay humble in front of them. Because that's what they need to see. It's what they need to learn. And so if people are not on the journey, you got to get down. Because you can get puffed up with your own pride. So you got to get down. You got to stay down. You got to get humble in front of them. You got to get humble in front of God. Secondly, you admonish them. You reason with them. You entreat with them. Verse 6, Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, of those who had spied out the land, tore their clothes, and they spoke to all the congregation, saying, the land which we passed through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord is pleased with us, then He will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. So you reason with people. When people are disengaged, you reason with them. You show them, look at what God is doing. Look at where God is taking us. Look up there. Don't look back there. Look at where we're going. Look at where He's taking us. So you try to show them that. You intercede for them. Verse 17. Moses says, now I pray, let the power of the Lord be great, just as thou hast declared. The Lord is slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness, forgiving iniquity and transgression, but He will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation. Verse 19, pardon, I pray, the iniquity of this people, according to the greatness of thy loving kindness, just as thou hast forgiven these people from Egypt until now. When people aren't on the trip with you, when people aren't on the journey, pray for them. Pray for them to see. Pray for God to open their eyes. Moses interceded for them. And then the last thing you have to do is you just have to let God sort out their destinies. You have to let the Lord sort out their destinies. Verse 20, it says, the Lord said, I've pardoned them according to your word, but indeed as I live, all the earth will be filled with the glory of the Lord, and surely all the men who have seen my glory and my signs, which I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, yet have put me to test these 10 times, and have not listened to my voice. They're not going in, Moses. They're not going in. Their kids are going to go in, but they're not going in. I'm not taking them in. They're going to die in the wilderness. Their corpses, he says, we're going to bury them in the wilderness, and we'll take in their kids. Verse 30, he says, surely you shall not come into the land which I swore to settle you in, except Caleb, he says. Verse 32, but as for you, your corpses shall fall in the wilderness, and your sons shall be shepherds for 40 years in the wilderness, and they shall suffer for your unfaithfulness until the corpses lie. And according to the number of days, he says, it would be a year. So they spied for 40 days, he said, they would wander for 40 years. And so when we oppose God's purposes because we're not engaged, because we're not involved, because we're not participants, and because we don't have the vision of where God is taking us, then we forfeit His blessing. We lose the inheritance. It slips away from us. But this is how we ought to behave when people do that. We got to get humble. We have to admonish them. We have to pray for them. And then we let God sort out people's hearts, people's destinies. Could I read to you again? I'm sorry I've gone so long today. You've listened so patiently. But could I read again from James? He says, "You too be patient. Strengthen your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Don't complain, brethren, against one another, that you yourselves may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing right at the door." Let's be a people with a great faith, shall we? Let's be a people who talk our faith, who talk it to God and who talk it to one another. Let's be a people who are patient, who wait on God, and who know He's going to be there. Let's be patient with each other, because that is the way of a people of faith. If you're in need of the Lord's help this morning, if you're in need of the Lord's forgiveness, if you're in need of the Lord's salvation, then won't you come to Jesus today as together we stand and as we sing.